Hello everyone, welcome back. This week is a bit of a long one, but don't worry, I'm breaking it up into 3 parts just so that we can all get through it with our sanity. Last week I sat down for 3 hours and talked with Anthony Riley, also known as Sleeping Warrior. We went through a lot of information, and at a couple points it turned into a little bit more of a debate than an interview. For this first segment, we'll sit down and hear a little bit about Anthony's history, where he gets his education from, and his favorite topics: gravity, buoyancy, and density. So stick around, grab a drink, and hold on for the ride. Today, I'm sitting down and talking with Sleeping Warrior, also known as Anthony Riley. Thank you very much for giving me a little bit of your time. Today's an opportunity for you to kind of open yourself up to the globe side and talk to us about yourself. So that's the goal of my interviews, is just to get to know you as a person and then kind of where you're coming from with your thought process. So if you would, start out, just tell us a little bit about how you grew up, where you grew up, family, stuff like that.
I'm 39. I was born in Liverpool, England. I grew up in a town called Aintree, and it's a deprived town. Well, I say town, it's an area, a region of Liverpool. It's known for having the Jacobs factory, which is basically making crackers and biscuits. And my outlook on life as a child was terrible because of where I was growing up, and the outlook was not good. It was bleak. My parents were conscious of that. We moved out of the area and we moved into a posher area, which was the bottom end of the privately owned market. My dad was a police officer, my mum was a nurse, very much working class, and basically I was dragged up in a decent area, and I went and did A-levels, then I went and did university, then I did a postgrad, working careers, usual like everybody else. And I started realising that, I came to Flat Earth through looking after looking into the 9/11 and the Apollo moon landing. I realised that 9/11 couldn't possibly have happened the way that we were told. The planes would have crumpled the minute they hit the building. Some of it might have gone through, the engines might have gone through, but I realised that these planes two planes could not have caused 3 buildings to collapse. And then I got onto the Apollo moon landings and realised that couldn't possibly have worked. Then I realised that the Giza pyramids weren't tombs, and then I ended up with the last one, which was flat Earth, and I didn't even bother looking at it because I realised that it was nonsense. And then I started looking into it because I'd kind of looked into all the other stuff, and I realised that there's stuff, this is the last one, is it possible that this has got any credibility to it whatsoever? And because I'd studied law, undergrad, postgrad, and I'd worked in the legal profession for years, I realised that I wanted to basically look into it to see whether or not there was anything credible in it. And I looked into it, and initially you just get flooded with information and you don't know where to turn. And I just went back to the principles that I was familiar with. Evidence, I looked at what evidence was good from a legal context. I looked at it and to see whether any of it was credible, verifiable, repeatable, observable, and were any of the elements that we were told is real world, were they actually good evidence for the point that was being made that we live on a sphere. I'd obviously seen Mark Sargent's Flat Earth Clues, I'd seen Dubé's 200 Proofs, and I just didn't really know where to turn. And I thought, well, let's start with the basics and see where we go. And I realised that they can't prove curvature, they can't prove axial rotation, they can't prove gravity, but we're told that these things are true. And when I look at the evidence that's presented to make these points, I have to question how does anybody not see the massive flaws with the evidence that they believe is true, when it's basically not credible, it's not repeatable, it's not verifiable. It wouldn't stand up in a court from a legal perspective. So why would anybody accept it? And my only conclusion that I came to was that people that accept that we live on a sphere don't have the critical ability to challenge or critically analyze the evidence they're presented with to see how strong the evidence actually is. So my angle on it is empirical. It's based on the evidence. It's based on how credible it is. It's based on how reliable it is, repeatable it is. How good is this evidence? Would it stand up in a court? And I realised that there is no evidence for a lot of the assertions that they say. But I also realised that a lot of the arguments that that are debated regularly, a lot of the arguments can be interpreted both ways. And it relies on the person's ability to interpret what they're looking at and realise that, well, this is one side, but then the other side say that. Which one is it? And I realised that a lot of the arguments can be interpreted 2 ways. Not all arguments, but most of them can be interpreted 2 ways. I then realized that there's got to be a ranking of the evidences to see which is the strongest or which is the weakest evidences to support either version. And I realized that basically there's holes in the evidence for the sphere, namely two observers looking south at the same time, seeing the same set of stars but in a different rotation pattern. That evidence doesn't exist. It's essential if we live on a sphere. And I realized that they can't prove gravity because they can't even reliably define what gravity is. Some people on the ball Earth side still preach that gravity is a force, but I realize that the current science states that it's not a force, it's an effect. But still people are saying it's a force. And I'm like, it's not a force. Why are you saying this? So it seems to me that the whole argument's full of obfuscation. It's full of deception. It's full of doublespeak. It's full of people saying stuff and meaning something else, or deliberately allowing people to think the opposite's true or whatever. And I just realised that this topic's totally conflated, convoluted, distorted. It's not consistent across the board. It should be the case that gravity is defined by all the ballers by one particular citation, because that's the current science. But none of them do it. They all claim it's a force. And I'm left in the middle thinking, how is this possible? How can anybody look up at the night sky, see the stars twinkling away, realise that they're in a vacuum, and then not question how we can have gas pressure next to the vacuum without it immediately bursting off? I mean, anybody that doesn't realise that has to be either too dumb to think about it or pushing it not falsely. If you're really on the fence, I mean, you can't get past the gas pressure next to a vacuum point without a container of some kind. But everybody just goes gravity, even though it's not a force. So it's full of doublespeak, cross references. It's none of the evidences or the arguments that I'm presented with have got any strength to them at all, and I can't accept them because none of them prove anything. They're all discussion based rather than empirical based, and I just don't know how anybody can accept any of it. So in a quick nutshell, that's my kind of journey, and I don't really know how to get any further into it without going into massive detail on the arguing points.
And the purpose for this conversation isn't necessarily for you to prove your points, for me to prove my points. Again, this is for my side to get insight into you as a person, not necessarily everything about your beliefs, but we can discuss a lot of that, and there's a lot of things that I would like to discuss. One of the things that you did bring up was the empirical evidence and your history with law. So if we could, are you okay? Can we backtrack a little bit and let's talk about your education in high school? Like what did you study in high school, sciences, and then what did you do after school? Like you'd mentioned law.
So high school in the UK, you have to do I think it's a mandatory. Well, when I did my GCSEs, you have to do a mandatory 9. Most people do 11. I finished high school with the 11 GCSEs. Everything was C or above. And I went on to college, and then I did A-levels in law, psychology, and information technology. Finished that with 3 A-levels, which then allowed me to go to university at undergrad levels studying straight law. I finished that, and then that allowed me then to do a postgrad. I did a postgrad. It was called, the full titles, a postgraduate diploma in legal practice. That then allows you to qualify as a legal practitioner, otherwise known as a solicitor. You guys in America call them a lawyer. But once you qualify with the postgraduate diploma in legal practice, that then gives you a top up to your master's degree, which is what I'm currently doing for the topic on flat Earth and the evidence that supports whether it's a sphere or not. I'm due to submit the dissertation imminently. And basically over my legal interest, be it educational or experience in the legal industry, you have to prove all parts of your claim to be successful in court. Now, you can never judge, you can never allow the judge, you can never account for the judge on the day being a little bit crazy and going against what your position is, but you have to prove all points of your claim, otherwise you can't win. And
so with the degree that you had, you were able to practice law for, like you said, in the United States, would be considered an attorney, a lawyer representing someone for...
No, not with the degree. You need the postgraduate. In England, you need to have the postgraduate diploma in legal practice. That's the thing that, it's called the LPC. That's the thing that allows you to be in the legal industry or the legal profession and practice. Your degree just gets you onto the course for the LPC. But overall, it's not something that's easy to do. It's really difficult to do. And the workload at postgrad level is high. The degree is not too high, but the postgrad work's really crazy. It's not easy. But that's why I look at these evidences for why the Earth's turning, or what's the molten iron core, what's the evidence for the molten iron core. And I look at that and I think, if this was in court, would these evidences prove the point that's being made? And every single time it's like, no, this isn't proving that point. It's inferring that point, but you can equally infer that it's not that point and it's being caused, someone else is causing the phenomena that we see. And that's why I look heavily at the scientific method, because the scientific method is the only standard of evidence in science that's seen as credible. Anything that's not scientific method related is by definition pseudoscience. And if you're going to go and try and argue to a judge pseudoscience to prove a point, it would take an eccentric judge to accept that there is pseudoscience prove a particular point in court. So if you're going to go with a molten iron core, we know that the deepest hole ever dug is 8 miles. They call a super deep borehole. And we know that that 8-mile deep hole isn't proving anything at 9 miles. They've got evidence up to 8 miles, but beyond 8 miles, they don't know what's down there. They can interpret it with seismology and interpret graphs or needle scratches, or you can do sonar. You can do a variety of technological applications, but that doesn't mean that you're going to know what's below 8 miles, because you've only got evidence 8 miles. But ballers look past that and think that there's a molten iron core. And I'm like, you don't know that. You believe it based on interpretation. You believe it based on secondary evidence, not good evidence, bad evidence, but it's your interpretation and you are entitled to it. But that's not acceptable. You wouldn't win in court if you presented evidence that went below 8 miles and you couldn't prove what was below 8 miles. You wouldn't win.
And we'll get to a lot of that. There's a lot of questions I've got as well, specific about that, and I've actually done a couple videos on the interior of the Earth that I'd like to talk about as well. When you were practicing law, did you have, or when you were studying even, did you have a specific area of law that you focused on? Civil court, criminal court, prosecution type of stuff. And if I don't know the British legal system, so please dumb it down so I can understand it.
I worked in civil law. I didn't work in criminal law, but in civil law, it's all about evidence. In criminal law, it's all about the semantics of the meanings of the words. Because again, you've got to establish, in criminal law, you have to establish that every element of the offence is committed. So if there's an element missing, then the guy doesn't get proven guilty, he gets found not guilty, because the prosecution case could not prove that all elements of the claim were satisfied. But in civil law, the law's not that difficult in terms of the interpretation of it. It's all about the evidence and what you can prove. So it's not what you know, it's not what you believe, it's not what you preach, it's what you can prove. Now, if we're saying on the one hand, well, that point doesn't prove the point that you're claiming, and they say, well, it does, then there's an issue there, isn't there? And ultimately, if you can't prove the point that you're claiming, then you're not going to win. And I worked in civil law, I worked in property, I worked in personal injury, I worked in costings as a cost draftsman.
What's that?
Basically, it's the billing. It's when you get the big file at the end and you get a big chunk of paper. You have to go through it page by page by page, and you quantify how much time's been spent on that case whilst it's being concluded, and to be able to present your bill to either the insurance company or to the judge for detailed assessment. But I mean, you start off at the bottom and you start off doing crappy jobs, and that is what I started doing in costings. So I was doing the bills initially. Then I moved into property law and started working in conveyancing or property law. And then from there, I ended up in road traffic accidents, and I was doing the usual, what they call ambulance chasing. And I didn't really enjoy it because it wasn't like a credible point to that part of law, but overall, it was still a job at the time. I needed a job. And then, cutting a long story short, I've come away from law because I became self-employed. But what I learned in law, and this is the bit that's not in Flat Earth, is that if you can't prove all elements of your claim, then the claim fails. You're not going to win in court, because the bit that you can't prove is the bit that the other side are going to attack. And if you haven't got strong evidence for that point, you might have 10 points that all support all of the other points, but that one piece that's missing, that's the bit that they're going to focus on. So, for example, if you're going to argue that there's some part of GPS, like if GPS is proving that the Earth's a sphere because they work, and if it wasn't a sphere, they wouldn't work, then you've got to prove the part that is the GPS satellites are orbiting the Earth. Well, we know that there's something up there, but you've got to prove that there's an orbit of a spherical object, of an object going around it, because we could equally argue that it's going laterally around it, and we can demonstrate it on a small scale with quantum levitation. So the issue is, like, how are you going to prove that there's an orbit of a spherical object when we can demonstrate quantum levitation on a lateral orbit? And we know that it's cold up there. So how do you prove that you're orbiting? And the ballers just look past it. And I'm like, well, that's major. You can't say that you're orbiting a sphere if you can't prove that you are orbiting a sphere.
With the civil court in the UK, what's the burden of proof?
On a balance of probabilities.
Is that like
So 50-50.
yeah, that's basically what in the United States for criminal it's beyond reasonable doubt, but for civil it's
Correct.
51%. Yeah, I just didn't know if it was
Yeah,
different in the
so
UK or
it's
not.
no, it's the same. In criminal law, it's beyond all reasonable doubt, and
Yep.
in civil law, it's on a balance of probabilities. So it's like, yeah, you like you say, 51%.
Okay. How long did you practice law?
4 years.
Okay. What made you leave law?
Self-employment, better hours, better wages,
What did
more efficient work type,
what did you
not
move
having
on
to
to?
commute. I started off with travel company. I started, and then I ended up with a motor mechanic. You're gonna have to put that on hold a sec.
Yep.
Right. So, do
All
you
right.
want to re-ask that question?
Yeah. What was it? You said that you had left law. I was just wondering what you left practicing law for. What did you move on to?
I went self-employed. I started off with a motor vehicle service and repair centre, a taxi firm, and a minibus company. And basically, it started to grow from there. And I did 10 years self-employed. And really, the main benefit for me was that I didn't have to commute into a city centre. The hours were much better. The money was comparable. I didn't have to get involved with all the stress of working in an office, and I was ready to move on. I didn't get satisfaction from work that I thought I would get, mainly because the commute is always into a city centre, and I just didn't enjoy the commuting side to it. Being stuck in traffic all the time, I hated it. So I wanted to work from home, and ultimately that was the main reason why I left it. I'd achieved what I wanted to achieve. I didn't feel as though there was much there for me to do it. I didn't feel as though I had to stick at it. I wanted to earn more money. I wanted to do less work, and I wasn't prepared to work in an office for the rest of my life, and that was the main reason why I left. And I don't regret it, to be honest. The money's always on its way down. It doesn't seem to be on the way up. And I don't like working in the city centre. I want to be able to not move, not travel to and from work, and that's what I enjoy the benefit of now.
How well is the pay for an attorney in the UK?
Well, your starting off salary is terrible, but once you get some qualified years, post-qualified experience, it starts to climb. But it's subject to each individual firm, so they've all got their own pay scale, and it depends on a variety of factors. It depends on where you are, but I mean, the wages are comparable to what I'm earning now, and I don't have to do half the work I would have been doing in an office. It's one of the most stressful jobs, but the wages you're looking at about 35,000 Great British pounds for an average law firm in an average city, which is a reasonable wage.
That's
But to
starting.
be honest, no, that's post qualified.
Okay.
Starting salary is about 20,
Oof.
so you gain 15 grand with post qualified experience. But traveling into and out of the cities is no fun, especially if they got roadworks on it. It's just our motorway networks are naff. Not desirable for me personally.
Is it one of those careers that can be extremely profitable, like it is in the United States?
You'd have to be in central London, and I don't live anywhere near London, but it can be. But it's very nepotistic, and I'm pretty much sure it's the same in America
Yeah.
as well. Nepotism is one of those things. It's not really what you know because everybody knows the same stuff by the time you get to that point. But by the time you get to that point, unless you know the right people, you're gonna be like flittering along on like a wave that's like neither cresting nor troughing. It's just gonna be a floating along. And for me personally, I found it to be too much repetition of a theme, and it was stressful. The money can be good, but it is nepotistic. It's nepotism gold, and unless you know the right people in the right places at the right time, you're not going to get the money that you hope to get as being like $100,000 a year salary. It's not going to get it. So I just basically looked at: do I want to be in an office all day, every day, earning the money that I was earning, or would I rather work from home and not have to do that? And that was ultimately the deciding factor: not commuting.
What was it that brought you into law to begin with?
Personal challenge to see if I could do it. I wanted to learn. I wanted to know more about the law. My dad being a cop, always
Yeah.
that was always in my life. I always had cops coming to and from the house. I was steered into law by the passive back door because my dad was a cop.
Hmm.
And I didn't necessarily want to go into criminal law, but I was interested in the law. I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn the differences between the offences. I wanted to learn what happens in the judicial system, how the judges are working, what happens when they go to jail, how jail works out, what happens with rehab. I wanted to learn the system because I wanted to know. I felt that not knowing was a blind handicap in the open labour market. I wanted to know. So I just started to learn it, and I loved learning it, but I didn't really enjoy doing it that much because lots of things can go wrong, and it's a really high stress job. If you look at if you look at the stress, one of the most stressful jobs, lawyers are one of them.
Yeah.
Like, it's not an attractive career for me personally. I wouldn't mind teaching it, but I just didn't really enjoy working it. And then when I had the opportunity to work self-employed from home, I took it.
Yeah, I work.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I work with a lot of criminal law lawyers. I'm a cop of sorts. I'm an investigator for the U.S. Army. So my job is like felony crime that soldiers commit. So I work the investigation, so cop like your dad, and then I give that to the lawyers to prosecute. So I don't have a whole lot of experience on the civil side, but I've got a fair amount of experience on the criminal side. Testified many times at trials and things of that nature. So at one point, I actually thought about going into law, but being active duty Army, it's just a little prohibitive to try and go to college and get a law degree.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I loved learning about it. I loved learning about This is where on Flat Earth, the discussion about it. Oh, it's just semantics. This is where the argument's going to be won or lost because semantics is important. Semantics is not a dirty word. If you're going to say that if something's not a force, for example, gravity is not a force, you can't treat that it is a force. If it's not a force, it's not a force. It can't cause anything, and that is the current science. It is deemed the current science is Einstein. It says it's not a force; it's an effect. And it's like, so if it's an effect, then it ain't pulling anything towards the center of the earth. Now, I'm not saying I agree with Einstein. I'm not saying I disagree with Einstein. I'm just making the point that the current science doesn't allow gravity to be a force. And by definition, if it's not a force, it's not interacting with anything. There's no push or a pull. That means the atmosphere is not sticking to the earth. And we need something to stop the atmosphere from bursting into space. But the ballers just they look past that and they say that's just semantics. I'm like, well, no, because you understand the meaning of not a force, right? It means that it's not doing anything. It's not interacting. That's not okay to look past that. But it's not a force. Yeah, it's not a force. So let's call it not a force and let's explain what's keeping the atmosphere on the ball if the atmosphere, if the depths of space is this continuous vacuum for infinity. Because we have a problem here. We have a real problem. And it's not okay to just say it's semantics and dismiss it. What's stopping the atmosphere from bursting off into space? Let's not have the argument over whether it's semantics or not. Let's have the science for what's holding the atmosphere on. And there is no science. And I look at that and I think, right, we have a problem here. And if you've got the interpretation issue that you must have, the minutiae and the semantics and the meanings of words is important. Gravity is not a force. So what is holding? I mean, let me ask you. I know we don't want to get into a debate. Do you not have that paradox in your mind about what's holding the atmosphere on?
I don't, because I believe that gravity is whatever it is. I think that gravity exists, and gravity creates the functional equivalent of a container for the atmosphere that is being held onto the Earth.
But what's holding it onto the Earth?
Gravity itself.
But Einstein said that gravity is not a force.
I think that, you said, the semantics of it, but I think that I think that's the semantics of it. And I'm not one to debate or discuss that because I am not as smart as a lot of other people on the internet to be able to talk about the specifics of Einstein and Newton and all of those people. But to me, gravity, whether it's a force or whether it's anything else, is mass attracting mass. However it happens, however it works, gravity.
But to you,
equates.
But to you, though, what you just stated there is a position that's not the current science. And let me translate that into your work. So you've got a squaddy, and he's accused of theft, and you'll be able to recite the definition of theft off the tip of your tongue, right? Mm-hmm. What is the definition of theft?
Taking something of someone else's property without their permission.
Yeah, but there is a legal definition for theft, though, right?
Yes.
And if he was to be charged with theft, he would your lead case, your job would be to prove that guy satisfied all elements of that definition for theft.
Correct.
Right? So we've got gravity that's claimed to be mass attracting mass by your words. Einstein says it's not a force, it's an effect. And then I would then put that back to you and say, sorry, what was your first name? Blake. I'd say if we were in the courtroom and rather than talking about the squaddy with theft, if I were talking about flat earth with you, I'd say, Blake, Einstein is the current citation for theft. Einstein is the current citation for gravity, and he says that it's not a force. I put it to you, Blake, that you believe a position that is untenable. Einstein says that you're wrong. How would you respond? So Einstein's telling you that it's not a force, But you believe that mass is attracting mass, and that's clearly contradictory. It's the paradox position. It's the antithesis. And I'm going to point out to the judge, Blake, you're in a position of complete contradiction. Einstein says it's not a force. It's not attracting anything. Mass is not attracting mass. It's an effect if it exists at all. How do you respond to the judge to prove your point?
Again, I would say it's probably semantics, but however it manifests itself, however it reaches out and does its thing at a quantum level, at a physical level that most of us in this courtroom do not understand, it is demonstrated that mass does attract mass.
Right, so then I would cite George Musa on the Fight the Flat Earth interview, where he said that there's nothing reaching out to the moon, pulling it towards the Earth. They were his words. So then I would say, you're in a state of contradiction again, Blake. How are you going to respond?
That whatever part of this debate that he's having may be very specific in its nature and not all-encompassing as for the conversation. We still have observational...
But this was the specific point, though. It was mass, was gravity a force? And his words were, gravity is not a force, but you can think of it as a force. And when he was referencing the moon, he said, technically it's not a force. He says, there's nothing reaching out to the moon. He's basically negating that it's a force. There's no interaction between the Earth and the moon. So there's no interaction between the Earth and the atmosphere either. But there's got to be something that's holding the atmosphere here, because the other side of the atmosphere is a vacuum of space. And that differential is gargantuan. You can reduce it down into numerical form and say that it's not that much. But the reality is we can crush a container, a tanker, with a small differential. And we can demonstrate that even a really minute differential against your human skin, that change in pressure causes red blotchiness and it causes problems. And if you increase that pressure against, or the differential against your skin, you're going to start causing problems. I mean, there's videos online to demonstrate that. And if you're going to argue that it's just semantics, I'd say that's where the argument's won and lost. I'm going to say that there is nothing reaching out. George Musa said there's nothing reaching out between the Earth and the moon. That means there's no interaction. But we do have a gas pressure. We do have a pressure gradient or a density gradient. But you can't have that if there's a vacuum that's 10 to the minus 17 torr without some kind of containment. Now, I'm not saying that there's a dome, but I am saying that we have a gas pressure. We're breathing it. I am saying that there's a density gradient. We're breathing it. And we have a dynamic, massive sun that mixes it all up with the nitrogen cycle, the oxygen cycle, the nitrogen, the carbon, the hydrological cycle is all mixing it all up in a big dynamic, continuously evolving system. But we must be contained by something to have that. Otherwise, it would all burst into the void of space immediately, because we can demonstrate it on a small scale. You pop a balloon, it bursts. So this is really the biggest argument for why I have with the ballers, because they look past it. And like I said to yourself, they just say it's a semantic argument. But if you go into a courtroom and you accuse the squaddy of theft and you can't prove that he was being dishonest, what do you think is going to happen to your claim against the squaddy if you can't prove that he was dishonest?
Well, my rebuttal to the questioning, if I were on the stand for gravity, would be that the difference between the laws of the squaddy and the laws of nature, well, not necessarily the laws of nature, but the current understanding of science, is that laws are written by man and they are finite and they are exact. Sometimes they're extremely wrong, but at the time they're written, they are the law. But science is an ever-changing and ever-evolving understanding of the natural world, and regardless of what the current understanding of it is, how we describe it, how we explain it, and what is actually happening with the reaching out to the moon, as George Musser said, regardless of that and our current understanding of it, we still have examples of mass attracting mass.
Right, we don't have any examples of mass attracting mass. If you're going to cite Cavendish, he was debunked by Einstein. There is no mass attracting mass. It doesn't happen.
I would argue that. I would argue against that because I have a Cavendish about 30 feet that way.
And have you ever demonstrated it successfully?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd love to see that.
Check my channel. I'll send you a link. I have literally, and I'm going to probably show this on Ranty's channel over the next couple weeks. I've been here in Korea for about 10 months, and I've been building a Cavendish in my spare bedroom for the past 8. And I've been getting information from the internet and from people online and YouTube, trying to remove variables. Now my dog's on the floor whining as well. But I've been getting crowd information of how to perfect it to remove variables. And literally right now there's tape around the door, so there's no draft going in. I've got a USB cable coming outside, 4 cameras inside,
and a motor to be able to control moving my heavy masses in and out.
Okay.
So I've removed as many variables as I can, and I've got several videos I can show you that when I introduce the weights, the small weights move.
Okay, so what I'll say is I'll give you Cavendish. I'll then trump you with Einstein, who says that gravity is not a force. There is no interaction. So if you think that there is, and Cavendish proves something, then you're actually pitching yourself against Einstein. But going back to what you said about laws, you said that laws are something that man's decided or man has made these laws. Now that's not the definition of a law in science. A law is what nature does. It's what nature does. It's not what man's defined it.
No. When I was talking laws, I was talking criminal laws.
Oh, right, yeah, man-made laws.
Yep, criminal laws are hard and written, whereas natural phenomenon are constantly being observed and reevaluated.
Right, so hot will always go to cold, always. Don't know why it's not the other way around. Cold doesn't go to hot, but hot always goes to cold. It's the second law of thermodynamics. So that always happens. We don't know why it happens. We can't prove what's causing it. We just know that it does, and it's called the law of nature. But we can demonstrate that pressure always goes to non-pressure. It doesn't. Non-pressure doesn't go to pressure. It's always pressure that goes to non-pressure, and it's always that way around. And we can demonstrate that. We don't know why it does it, but it just does it. So we know that if pressure always goes to non-pressure, and we know that if temperature always goes to cold, then why is it that the atmosphere does not immediately fill the void of space? Because that's what it says. That is the law of nature that requires that pressure will always equalize with non-pressure. And we shouldn't be breathing an air. We shouldn't be breathing an atmosphere.
If there is mass attracting mass, that would explain it.
But Einstein said that mass isn't attracting mass. He said that gravity is the effect of the curvature of space-time. So even if your mass is attracting mass...
Either way, how you describe it...
You're arguing against Einstein.
However you describe it. And again, science is a ever-changing understanding of the natural world.
Sure, and by 1914, 1915, when Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity was published, that effectively removed the mass attracting mass argument, and you're arguing a position that's pre-1915. Well, I'm arguing a position that's post-1915, and is the current science that debunks your position that gravity is a mass attracting mass.
If mass doesn't attract mass because of the revelations of Einstein, what is happening in my spare bedroom?
If you look into the Cavendish experiments, he says in Cavendish's actual paper that he submitted to the Royal Society, his words were, "It is clear that a minute disturbing force will thwart the attempts or the effects in this experiment."
Oh, I won't deny that at all. I can tell you.
I'll put it to you that there's something else influencing it, and it's probably your body temperature that's creating a thermal current around you.
I'm not in the room. Or
something else that's. Okay, there's something else causing it. It says it is clear in his paper. It says it is clear that a minute disturbing force will effectively foil this experiment. I would say that your minute disturbing force is giving you the result, and it's a false positive. And the reason why I say that is because Einstein said that gravity is not a force. So you can try proving that gravity is a force all day, but you're not going to get past Einstein.
Either way, with the description of how it happens, the observation, that's all I want to talk about. What we'd talk about is the observation itself. Again, I've removed virtually every variable I can, and when I introduce the large weights, the small weights move. When I remove the large weights, the small weights go back. So there is something about the large weights that cause that move.
Okay, so just for the sake of moving forward, I'll give you that you've got something that's attracting and it appears to be a mass attracting mass. I'll give you that. That doesn't debunk Einstein. Einstein said that gravity is not a force. So even if you want to think that you've got a mass attracting mass experiment in your bedroom, then Einstein is the one that you're debunking. So that's like you arguing a case that was decided in 1995 that's been reversed against the prisoner or the squaddie that's made a mistake. And you're arguing a case of 1995 that's been superseded. You'd lose.
Now, regardless of arguing, the semantics of it, do you think that what I have in my bedroom is a actual scientific experiment?
No.
Why is that?
There's no observed phenomena. It's the first step of the scientific method. Your first step is observe a physical and natural phenomena. Well, what's the phenomena that we're observing?
My response to that would be things falling down, the apparent orbit of the moon, which we'll argue that flat Earth, but you can see bodies orbiting bodies in space as well. You can see the moons of Jupiter going around it. If you observe that long enough, and you observe other the inferior planets going around the sun. They clearly go around the sun. The body's going around Jupiter. The body's going around Mars. Things go around other things. And I would say that in any universe, if you thought about it long enough, someone would come up with the thought that, hey, the small bodies are going around the big bodies. Maybe it's the physical size of it that's causing this. So that would be my natural observation.
Sure. So your natural observation in your second instance, the bodies orbiting each other, that's an observed phenomena. What's causing it? Yeah, you can theorize. You can correlate.
Yep.
Yeah, theory and correlate, right? So can you prove? And the question is no, because nobody can get there. If you believe, I don't want to go into the NASA tangents. I think NASA can stay out of this one for the purpose of moving forward. But going back to your previous statement, then your first thing you said was that things appear to fall down. Well, if I've got a helium balloon and it's trapped on the underside of a shelf, then I pull it down and let go of it, it's going to go straight back up to the underside of the shelf. Mm-hmm. So that's an observed phenomena that we would want to know what's causing that, but it's not consistent with gravity. So what your guys would argue is, well, that's the buoyancy, and that's caused by gravity. Well, we know that it's medium dependent. We know that helium balloon in the medium of air will rise. But if you then fill that volume of air with sulfur hexafluoride, which is a very heavy gas, that's going to rise faster. But then if you change the medium from sulfur hexafluoride, if you change the medium to hydrogen, the helium balloon's not going to go down because hydrogen is less dense than the helium balloon. Sorry, helium balloon won't rise because the hydrogen is less dense than it, and it'll stay on the floor. So we know that we can manipulate what that helium balloon does by playing around with the medium. I did it myself with the egg experiment. I'm sure you've seen the egg experiment where I put a bit of salt in the water, and rather than increasing the mass below the egg and pulling the egg towards it, it went the opposite way. Oh, well, that's buoyancy caused by gravity. Oh, really? We didn't change gravity though, did I? I added mass and density to below the egg, and that made it move. And the cause was changing the density of the gradient that we were in. It added more density below the egg. That changed the gradient, and then the egg was forced upwards by pressure. That's what caused it. No, that was buoyancy. But we didn't change gravity or buoyancy to cause the effect. We added mass. So if you're going to argue that the egg moved because of density, because of gravity or buoyancy, you're ignoring the fact that I put the mass into it. And by definition, that's the independent variable, the thing that I manipulate, the density of adding the salt. That's the cause in a scientific experiment.
But is that,
so if you're going to depart from
that
and
the
say that
ultimate cause?
In scientific method, yes. You can't infer extra causes.
I would say that that's a starting point, but you can do a lot of experiments where the very first experiments has a cause and an effect, but that cause is not the bottom line reason for the effect.
Right, and that's the whole point of science, to debunk the assertion originally. If somebody says that there's something else causing it, and then they do an experiment where they demonstrate with experiment that there was something else causing it, then you can consider the first experiment to be debunked.
Well, not necessarily that you debunked the first experiment. It's that you refined it more. Yes, I did A and B happened. A is also constituted with A through Z. Which one of A through Z in A are the cause or causes of B? It's refining the experiments further and further and further, whereas salt didn't make that egg rise. There is something more basic that caused it to rise. Salt is not the cause. Salt is a facilitator, I would say.
I agree. We know that the salt's got more mass to it than the water. There's more mass in salt than there is in water. And we see that when it trickles down past the egg. We see that because it goes below the egg. But when you add mass below the egg, that mass, the increase in density that's below the egg changes. It adds a layer of density that wasn't previously there. So it shifts all the layers of density above it up a little bit. Not much, but up a little bit. Yep. But that makes the egg sat not in a position that's relative anymore to where it should be. So the egg's got to rise with the density layers above it, and that's why we see the egg move. But that's obviously what's happened. But ballers say, it's gravity and buoyancy. No, I didn't manipulate gravity or buoyancy. I added mass, and you saw me do that. That's why I recorded it. So for you to argue density and gravity and buoyancy means that you're disregarding the bit that the actual bit that I did, which was pour salt in. And that's not acceptable because that's the bit I did. That's why I recorded it.
Is there a chance, though, that your act caused the action, but gravity is one of the factors?
But if it is one of the factors, then science has got to demonstrate that it is one of the factors. Otherwise, they're inferring that it is with no evidence. And you know what happens in court if you make an assertion without any supporting evidence? It gets dropped.
Yeah. So, but you're saying that there is a world where gravity could be a factor in the experiment you conducted, as long as somebody is able to show that gravity is a component of that experiment.
Right. And if you were then to use your Cavendish experiment to support your assertion, I would debunk you with a more recent case that states that Cavendish is not the current citation. The current citation for gravitation is Albert Einstein, and he said it's the effect of the curvature of space-time, a mathematical construct that only exists in maths. It's got no experimental application whatsoever. You could never prove it, even if you wanted to prove it. So I'll give you that your little Foucault's pendulum or your Cavendish experiment proves mass attracting mass. But I'll then double my stake on it and say that you've got to debunk Einstein, and he is the current science. And then I'd say, so what else have you got?
Couldn't I add Einstein's into my experiments? You know, the base level understanding is mass attracting mass. A deeper level understanding is the curvature of space-time. When I move the larger masses towards the smaller masses, I am physically changing the curvature of space-time, which is causing the smaller masses to move.
So you described it as a base level understanding is mass attracting mass, and a more detailed understanding is the curvature of space-time. It's not a refinement; it's a replacement. For example,
a better understanding.
Einstein's
because it's a better understanding of it because the curvature.
No, it's not. It's not. It's not. It's not a refinement. It's a replacement because Einstein's bending of space-time was limited to the speed of light. Whereas Newton's mass attracting mass was instantaneous over any distance. It was the effect of gravitation, right? Masses pulling on masses. But Einstein's is limited to the speed of light. Einstein's is four-dimensional. You've got like X, Y, Z and time. But that's not the same geometry as Newton's. Newton's is only X, Y, and Z. So you've got two glaring, contrasting positions there that don't make them comparable.
The thing is, the speed of light wasn't known at the time. The speed of light wasn't known at the time of Isaac Newton, though.
But Einstein's is limited to the speed of light.
Yes.
Because it's all based, special and general relativity is based on the speed of light.
Yes.
To him, it's a constant.
Yes. So
that makes it a limitation.
With the again, base level understanding that Newton had of mass attracting mass instantaneously, because he didn't have the forethought, insight, knowledge of the speed of light to realize that there could be a limit to it, his description of it was mass attracting mass. When it was further evaluated, Einstein refined it. Yes, it is mass attracting mass, but technically it's mass causing the curvature of space-time at the speed of light, which was not previously known.
Einstein didn't refine. Einstein replaced. You're misrepresenting what Einstein did with something that Einstein did not do, because you're reading pop science articles and being influenced by people like Fight the Flat Earth, who will not let this argument go. Einstein said that it is an effect of the curvature of space-time. An effect is not a cause. So now bear with me. Bear with me. The effect of the curvature of space-time is a mathematical thought experiment. It's not something that's physical. It's not got any tangibility to it. We can't test it with experiments. It only exists in maths. So when people claim that they reduce down to Newtonian principles, they don't reduce down to Newtonian principles, because Newtonian principles were based on there being a mass attractive mass. Well, Einstein said that's not what's happening. So they don't reduce down to it. You can believe that if you want to, but if we got into court and I presented arguments to say that it's evidence from Einstein showing that it was a mathematical construct and it only existed in that concept known as maths, then that, even if it's ridiculous, that is the current citation. Now, I'm not saying I agree with Einstein. I disagree with Einstein, but that's the current science. But you're arguing a pre-1915 position that's been replaced. Now, you can call it refinement if you want, but it isn't refinement. Like I said, Einstein was limited to the speed of light, and it was four-dimensional. Newtonian principles were instantaneous action at a distance and only in 3 dimensions. You can't correlate the same. You can't overlap the same. They're not comparable. They're not a refinement. It's a replacement.
So then if we go with the Einsteinian principle of curvature of space-time, what is the cause under Einstein for the curvature of space-time?
It's a mathematical concept that he says that mass is attracting mass, which is warping space-time. Mm-hmm. So the object isn't being attracted towards the mass. It's the space-time, the curvature of the space-time in between that's bending, and that's what we perceive to be a curved path, but it's actually a straight line. So it's kind of like looking at a lava lamp, or maybe looking through the lens, through a lens of a ball and it distorts all the lines, we're seeing them as when we see through a curved ball, we're seeing straight lines that we know are straight, but they're curving through the lens. He's saying that we're seeing the paths and the trajectories of orbits and stuff. We're seeing them as a curved path or as an orbit, but actually they're straight lines. And that's what he's saying is caused by the manipulation of space-time, which is caused by mass attractive mass. But masses aren't attractive mass, they're curving space-time, and that's a mathematical construct that only exists in maths. It doesn't exist real world, it's not real.
Okay, so then with my experiment, I currently have 20-pound heavyweights, and under the Einsteinian principle, that is a mathematical construct of curvature of space-time that you say that is not observable in reality. What about when I change those weights? Because you can use that mathematical construct of the principle from the heavyweights, and it causes one effect. And if I replace those heavyweights with a different weight, the maths will change. It is still a mathematical construct, but it should change the results. And both of them are physical demonstrations of the mathematical construct that you said is not in reality.
So what you're arguing is that Einstein's theory on general relativity must therefore be wrong.
No.
And to prove that it's not. Yeah, that is what you're arguing.
I changed in this scenario, which I'm actually going to do, I'm changing the mathematical construct by changing the mass that is causing the warping of space-time.
Personally, I would agree with you. If you can do that more, if you can demonstrate that there is a change in the results by manipulating whatever, then I would say that's more compliant with scientific method than anything that Einstein ever gave. But you're stuck with the paradox, which is the current definition of gravity, whether you like it or not. So no matter what you do in that experiment that you're claiming is an experiment, that isn't really an experiment because it doesn't have an observed phenomena. But anyway, in any event, let's just say that it is, and let's say that you are mass attracting mass. It doesn't change the fact that Einstein is the leading in current science for gravity, and he will always prevail unless somebody debunks him. So if you're going to say, well, my mass is attractive mass, then I'm going to say, well, then you need to change the paradigm, because at current position, it's Einstein, and he says it's not. So you'd have to really submit your results to a paper, to a journal, and demonstrate that mass does attract mass and that Einstein was wrong.
Then could I just rephrase the terminology and say that my warping of space-time is causing warping of space-time? Attraction of another warp space-time?
So if we translate Einstein's theory into what you're demonstrating with your Cavendish experiment, he would argue that it's not mass attractive mass that's given us the effect. What it's doing is it's bending space-time in between the two masses. Correct. That's causing a curved trajectory of the object. But the object's moving in a straight line, and from Earth's perspective, it appears to be a curve. You'd have to have another little body that you're observing from, like you'd have to be on a little planet somewhere in that setup. And from your observation point, the mass attractive mass wouldn't actually be a mass attractive mass in a curved path. It'd be a straight line. But listen, it only exists in mathematics. It doesn't have any, and it only exists with one body. It doesn't work when you have two bodies. It's limited to one body, or the vacuum of space that has no bodies in it. It doesn't work with two bodies either. So Einstein's principles are limited by numerous things, but my point is that whilst I accept that you're having a legitimate attempt to do the Cavendish, it doesn't supersede Einstein being the current citation for gravity. And even if you were to prove within scientific method, which you can't, but if you did, and I'll give you that you did, let's just say you did, you've still got to debunk Einstein because he is the current science. And that's why I've been beating the drum about it that much, because everybody wants to believe that Cavendish proves something. Well, let's say it does. It's still the current position that Einstein is the lead authority in the general theory of general relativity, which states that gravity is an effect, it's not a cause.
Okay. I think we can move on. We've talked about that quite enough. But yeah, and when we're done, I'll show you the experiment. I'm kind of proud of it. I put a lot of work into it. I'm trying to remove every variable I can. And I'm running it over and over and over again to try and verify my results. You'd mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily know if you believe in a dome or not. What are your thoughts on that?
I realize that we're breathing gas pressure. The definition of gas pressure everywhere, if you type in Google, just type in what causes gas pressure, it's the container. You've got to have the gas in the first place, and you've got to have a container because the pressure is the collision of the particles of the gas bouncing against the inside walls of the container, be it whatever shape, be it square, rectangle, round, whatever. We have to be contained to have gas pressure. I realized that the current citation for gravity doesn't permit a force. There is no force. It's the effect of curvature of space-time. And that creates a paradox because we do breathe gas pressure and we're told we live in an open system. When we know that because they tell us rockets went to the moon. We know that rockets come and go. Satellites are out there. So we do live in an open system. So we have gas pressure. Well, we know gravity is not a force. So if gravity is not a force, then that's not holding the atmosphere down. But if we know that gravity is not a force and that's not holding the atmosphere down, what is? Because something's got to be holding it down because we have an open system and we are in a pressurized system. And if the vacuum of space is 10 to the minus 17 torr, then that pressure is immediately going to fill the volume. It's not going to gradually do it like a slow puncher. It's going to immediately fill the volume, and we don't experience that. So I realized that by virtue of the fact that we have gas pressure, we must be living in a contained environment of some kind, not necessarily a dome. It could be a dome, but there could just be a layer of, if you look on a phase diagram for hydrogen or a phase diagram for helium, it shows that, go with hydrogen. Hydrogen is the lightest element, and if you look at the phase diagram for that, you can see that at very low temperatures and very low pressures, you can see that they become solid. Well, if space is cold, we know it's pretty cold up there because you can't survive outside a plane for very long. You need heat. If it is cold up there, and if hydrogen and helium both exist up there and it's really cold, the chances are they're going to exist up there as a solid because it's very cold and the temperature, because it's cold and the pressure is very low, because we can demonstrate that at ground level, there's more pressure here. If you have hydrogen in big quantities and it's cold and it's at low pressure, that exists as a solid. So does that mean that there's a dome above us? No. Does it mean that there is the possibility of some kind of solid structure above us? Absolutely. It depends on how much of it is up there, and we don't know how much is up there. But we know that there's things called superfluid helium, where that can seep through liquids and through solids, and it shouldn't do. So we know that at the atmospheric pressure and the temperature that we exist on Earth, we know that is one world. But there is a whole other world out there when it's very cold temperatures, supercritical temperatures, where fluids become solids and solids become weird stuff. Superfluid helium is a good example of stuff that happens that we can't really explain because we don't live in that environment, and it's very difficult to recreate. But we can create it, and we know that it's cold up there, and we know that there's not a lot of pressure. So for me, when you look at the phase diagram, that tells you that there is going to be volumes or amounts of helium and hydrogen that are in solid state. It's just a question of how much of it is there. And I don't know whether there's a lot up there or not, but I realize that we must be living in a containment of some kind because we have gas pressure. It's in the definition. So can you imagine going to the tribunal at where the squad is charged with something? And then he cites back to you the definition and says, actually, there's the definition for why I've not committed this crime, and I've done this, and therefore I've satisfied that definition. I'd then point to you that the definition of gas pressure requires gas and it requires containment. And we have gas and we have containment. But we live in an open system where rockets can come and go. So we know on the open system there is no dome. There is no barrier to keep the pressure in. We know that gravity is described by Albert Einstein as not a force. So what is keeping the pressure in? So do I think there's a dome? No, there might be a dome, but I do realize that it has to be contained somehow because we have gas pressure and we have an open system and we have gravity with no force. So we're in a paradox, and that's why I don't know is the best answer to give. Okay. Because we're in a paradigm. We have gas pressure, but we're in an open system and gravity is not a force. So how do we have gas pressure? Don't know.
So the one question I would have for that then is, so you admit that we have a pressure gradient. A gas pressure gets less as we go up. Whatever that physical structure is, or gas structure, or whatever, what do you think would happen if we doubled it in size? What do you think would happen if?
Do you agree?
Go ahead.
Sorry, we're over speaking each other. There's a bit of lag.
The kind of the question is that, if the dome or whatever the structure is X amount of high, and our gas pressure has gotten to, let's say, 7 pounds per square inch rather than the 14 at sea level, what would happen if we literally just physically doubled the size of the dome? Wouldn't that gas pressure continue to decrease until, in theory, at some point get to zero in the system we currently live?
Probably, but we can speculate about everything. I mean, it doesn't mean it's true. But what my point is that if we have gas pressure and we breathe it, and we know gravity is not a force, and we know we live in an open system because rockets can come and go to the moon, then there must be something stopping that gas pressure from filling the void of space. And there isn't one. There is no barrier.
I would say there doesn't have to be one, even on the flat Earth model, because if you just physically doubled the size of the dome, the pressure gradient would continue to go down and down and down. And if you kept making it bigger and bigger and bigger in the dome, at some point on this flat Earth, you would reach a pressure of 0, because the gradient would go, unless there is some other reason that would stop it at 2% or 2 pounds per square inch of gas at this height, and then it just stayed at 2 pounds per square inch forever until it hit the dome. But if we just made the dome bigger and bigger and bigger, wouldn't in theory the pressure continue down until it got to 0?
Double the volume, you'd halve the pressure. So your 14.7 would become 7.2, 7.4, right?
Yeah. Or yeah, whatever it is. I'm not math.
Yes. So the 14.7 would immediately fill the volume and it would become 7.
But it wouldn't immediately, if we had the exact same amount of gas, if we did not increase the amount of gas in the system and we just doubled the size of the system, it would put the gas pressure at sea level 50% of what it is now.
Yeah, so it was 14.7 would be halved and it would be 7.
Yep. And then the pressure gradient would go even quicker, wouldn't it?
But you do realize that the further and the bigger you make that, then the gas pressure gets less and less and less immediately, and it happens immediately. It doesn't happen slowly. So if you were to make that container the infinite size of space, then there would be no pressure.
There'd be no pressure. Not anywhere.
Well, there wouldn't be any pressure because it would fill it, wouldn't it? It would fill the available volume. That's what gas pressure does. It fills the volume. So if your volume's an infinite, then you have no pressure.
True.
But that's what we're told we live in. You've just contradicted yourself there right away. Literally, I don't know if you want to play this back and listen to what you just said.
No, I understand. I fully get the way you spun that, and I understand it. But I
didn't spin it.
No. I
spin it. I applied it based on your thought experiment.
And it's something that I'd had in my head for a long time that I wanted to talk to somebody about. So I'm not denying the point that you've made.
And I didn't spin it. I just applied what you'd asked me to apply and progressed it to its logical conclusion. And if the volume or the dome became infinite and became the vacuum of space, there would be no pressure, and it would be instantaneous as well. It wouldn't be a slow puncture. It would be an explosion into space, and it'd fill that volume. So it's like we have gas pressure. So what is giving us that ability to breathe? And the answer to me and you, honestly, is I don't know.
Yeah.
Because they tell us one hand it's gravity, and then Einstein says it's not a force, but we do breathe it. So something must be causing it, and we don't know what's causing it, but we need to have reasons and answers, and that's why science exists, right? But the reality is we do not know what's causing the gas pressure. It can't exist in a vacuum. It can't exist in an open container. It has to be contained because we wouldn't have pressure. So what is causing it then? And for me, it's containment. I'm not saying dome, but I am saying that it has to be contained because we have gas pressure. That is the proof.
Yeah, and I'm man enough to admit that you've just debunked one of my thought experiments. It's not a fitting example.
Yeah, and that's ultimately that's the biggest reason for why I wonder why any baller could ever really accept that we live in an open system with gas pressure. Once Einstein says it's not a force. Because even if Einstein's wrong, we're still in an open system. Let's just say gravity is a force. We're still in an open system. We've still got the gas pressure, and we've still got 10 to the minus 17 torr, which the differential between those two is incredible. But gravity is defined as the weakest of the forces. It ain't going to be strong enough to hold the atmosphere onto the ball. It ain't going to be strong enough to hold the oceans or the waters of the world onto the ball. It's so small that if you look at the elastic collisions of gas particles, even George Netanyahu states that the elastic collisions of gas pressure, if the force of gravity would be so small, it would be negligible. But the minute you say gravity is a force, even if we give you that gravity is a force, that is enough then for everybody to scale it up to infinity to explain how the gas pressure exists. But George Netanyahu on the ball earth side states that the elastic collisions in the gas pressure, the effect of gravity on it is so small it would be negligible. You couldn't have gas pressure existing in an open system. It's that simple. And it's like, guys, we're not being dishonest. We're just asking, how is this explained, and where's the demonstration that proves it? And there isn't one. So it's like, well, does that mean that we're living on a flat plane with a dome? No. but it doesn't mean that we're living on a ball orbiting in deep space. Yeah, we're not living on that. Doesn't mean what we are. We don't know what we're living on, but we do know what we're not living on because the gas pressure point does kill it.
I don't know the math to do the gravity equations, if gravity is real, to show how it would pull gas particles down. I honestly don't know the math enough for it, and I didn't see what Jordan Netnuke said about it. But it would be a good area to know the math of it, to see if the math actually works.
Well, maths isn't the proof. Demonstration's the proof. Experiment's the proof. That's the definition of science. Demonstrate that the gas pressure can exist in a container that's a vacuum. I mean, you can't have gas pressure without a container, right? But you can't have a vacuum without a container either.
My request then would be demonstrate the container.
Yeah, but do you understand that to even have a vacuum, a differential in between two gas pressures, you need a container, right? So if we've got space as one of the mediums, that in itself, if it's a vacuum, the way we're told, 10 to the minus 17 torr, that's got to be contained, because you can't have a vacuum without a container. But if you have a gas pressure within a vacuum, then you've got to have some kind of containment, because you've got a container to house the lack of pressure, but then you've got to have another container to house the pressure. Because otherwise, like you said, if you double the volume and keep doubling it and doubling it and doubling it, you have no gas pressure because it fills the volume.
I would say my position is that people much smarter than me over the past 200 years have done the research into gravity and gas pressure. My request for the opposite side would be, please show me evidence of a container.
Yeah, but the evidence is that we have gas pressure. We breathe it every day, and we can't have gas pressure without a container. You've just said it yourself. So I have to prove that there's a container, or do you have to accept the fact that we do breathe gas pressure?
Wouldn't that be the end of the argument, though?
Well, it would, but I mean, what have we got? A P900 and a compass. What would you expect us to be able to demonstrate with a P900 and a compass?
Well, plenty of people claim that there's a dome or things of that nature. If it's there, show some evidence of it, and you would probably shut a lot of people up. Why isn't there a movement to find it?
Gas pressure is the evidence of it.
No,
come on, gas pressure is the evidence of it. That proves that we're living in a contained environment, because you can't have gas pressure without containment. That is the proof. I don't know what the construct of it, or what it's made of, or where it is, but I realise that you can't have gas pressure in an open system because it would fill the volume immediately. You've said it yourself. So it's like, do I have to prove that there's a container, or can I just accept the fact that gas pressure can't exist? Listen, if NASA knew, are you familiar with Operation Dominic and Operation High Jump?
High Jump, I've heard the name. You familiarize me.
Operation Dominic is where they sent the nuclear bombs or kiloton weapons up into the atmosphere and tried to blow shit out of everything. And that just happened after the first high launch rocket launch of NASA. They got high enough to see what was up there, and then for the next 3 or 4 years they started blowing shit out of it for whatever reason. They called it testing of nuclear weapons, but it doesn't change the fact that whatever was going on up there, they were trying to blow it up, right? There seems to be a reason to be sending a lot of high yield nuclear weaponry up there to blow shit out of something for whatever reason. Now, my point is that, yeah, that's correlative only, but what happens if they got high enough to realise that there was something up there, maybe a big pair of eyes looking down on us, maybe a structure of some kind, maybe they realised that it was actually the dome. I'm not saying that there is a dome, but what I'm saying is it seems to be strongly suggestive that they got high enough to realise that there is a ceiling and they can't get out of here, and they wanted to try and blow it up to see what would happen if. I'm not saying that's true. But what I am saying is that we do have the gas pressure, and by yourself, if you increase the volume, then you are going to lose the gas pressure. It's going to keep falling half and half and half every time you double it. But we have gas pressure. Do I have to prove that there's a container? I haven't got any money. Flat earthers don't have any money. But is it possible that NASA know that there's a container and are hiding it because they've got the money to work it out, and we're playing catch up with no money, with just a P900 and a compass?
So that would kind of bring me to my next series of questioning. Why hide it, and what are they hiding?
They hide it to support their own existence, because science is the ultimate authority of man. You said yourself that you would appeal to other people that were much more intelligent than yourself to demonstrate a particular point. Well, if you were science and you realised that we weren't here because of a cosmic ejaculation where something exploded and matter... I mean, the number one law, the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. But if you believe the science, then nothing exploded into everything, which is the creation of life, energy. But that can't happen from nothing, because matter can't, like energy can neither be created nor destroyed. But something was created from nothing, because we're here. That's what they tell us is how we got here, right? But it's a breach of the first law of thermodynamics. So the reason for why they would hide it is if they got high enough to realize that there was some kind of ceiling, some kind of barrier, or maybe a big set of eyes looking down on you, to justify their own existence, they would hide it because they want us to be subject to man and think that all the answers lies in science. But the reality is, you see it yourself. We have gas pressure. It's an open system. It would immediately fill the available volume. It's the biggest argument against living on a sphere. Now, does that mean I have to prove, if you give me all the money and the rockets, I could probably prove what's up there. But they've got the rockets and the money. So is it more likely that they've got the answers and they're not telling me the answers? Or is it that they genuinely are researching space and all this, but they've got to explain how we've got the gas pressure that we're breathing?
With the hiding of it for science hiding it, but why would they have been hiding it for hundreds of years before the modern era?
To justify their own existence as a body of science.
Good job making it this far, everyone. Come back again tomorrow for part 2.